I've been on the circuit recently and speaking in a bunch of places. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's only 3 questions that basically every university everywhere asks you to speak on. Okay? Basically, what young people want to hear today is, how do you know there is a God? How do you know you have the right one? And how do you know the books of your Bible represent that God? And if you can answer those 3 questions, you could help America's university system dramatically today. So I go around and what's interesting is in many of these situations, people are asking questions, and they're earnest young people. I want to tell you, what keeps me jazzed about the future is spending time with young people that are committed to Jesus Christ. Because you're not going to see them on the news. They're not going to get represented. The only wackos get represented on the news, and politicians, and maybe they are the same thing. I don't know. But the point is that honestly, we have a time in American history right now where we have some great young. I still believe the best things to be created are in the next generation, not mine. And I believe that God isn't done yet. I'm not looking at these things and seeing ends. I'm seeing God in another phase of changing. Now, we spent time in the last hour talking about the 3 waves of judgment: seals, trumpets, bowls, or vials. The first 2 of those appear to me to be in the first half of the tribulation period. The last one appears to me to be in the second half, near the end of the tribulation period, ending with Jesus' return, and ending with Armageddon, followed by Jesus' return. It's the most anticlimactic battle in the Bible, because the nations of the world all come together to fight. They push Israel out to the edge. She has her back to the sea. She cannot escape. Jesus comes through the cloud, speaks, and they're all dead. I mean, Spielberg wouldn't do this one because it's way too fast at the end. You know, it doesn't have any drama at the end. Jesus wins. And the point of the whole story is, spoiler alert, Jesus wins. That's what we're supposed to be studying. Now, I want to tell you that there's a section in the tribulation period that we pick up in 4 chapters, in chapters 12 and 13, a little bit of 13, and 17 and 18. And these chapters tell us about one feature of the tribulation I didn't talk much about in the last hour. Yes, there's destruction on the earth. But I want to talk specifically about how God takes aim at one specific thing: a harlot. In the Bible, a marriage is the illustration of a walk with God. For Israel, in Hosea, they were God's bride. In Ephesians, the church, Jesus' bride. The illustration. But the imitation is friends with benefits. The imitation is harlotry. The expression of a relationship without the relationship. And that is what God calls religion. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how the story unfolds. Now, there are 5 players in 12 and 13 in the first part of our talk. 5 players that God marked out to play in a drama of how He's going to pull down the harlot of false religion, strip her bare, and make it clear to everybody she is not a walk with the real God. And then in chapters 17 and 18, the second part of it is, I want you to be able to see that this story as it plays out, it shows in 17 and 18 stages of destruction at the very end. That is, 5 players are introduced in 12 and 13, and then what they do when they get on the stage. How do they play out God's removing of this harlot? Now, but first, before I do that, I want to do something that's just fun for me, if I can. I'd like to tell you a story. This is God's big story. Let me say it this way. This is what I call the story of the Bible, all in one standing. You ready? In the beginning, the Bible is essentially a romance book. It's a relationship book. And the center of the story of the Bible is 2 marriages. My GCBI students should already know this. The 2 marriages that make up the book. So let's go back to the beginning. Before there was time, God created a world. He made millions and millions of beings. They did not procreate. They were beings that were a set number. He created them directly. He put them on 4 levels: cherubim, seraphim, archangel, and angel. And He created these 4 layers. And these layers were in a kingdom all together in an immaterial world, in a world like ours, but not ours, not physical and not timed. How does that work? I have no idea. There's no way I could explain to you time without time. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow are all the same point for God. How does that work? I have no idea. I'm telling you, God created time for mass. He created time for the cosmos in Genesis 1:14. The point I'm making is, before that, he created an angelic kingdom. He tells us through 2 poems of the Hebrew Scriptures that one of the angels closest to him, a cherub close to him, decided to peel away in revolt against him and took a third part of the angels with him. And just stick a pin in that and remember, 2/3 stayed on our side. Their side puffs up, but our side's bigger. Okay, just remember that, okay? So at any rate, it's interesting because when that happened, the angels that belonged to God all came on and said, God, did you see what they're doing? They're rebelling against you. And he said, pull up a harp and a cloud and sit down. I got to tell you a story. I don't know if that's how he did it, but yeah, you know what I mean. And so he says, I want to tell you a story. And the story, at the center of the story, is going to be some marriages. This is what he does. God creates the planets. He flings 1 quintillion stars into the heavens. And then in one of those galaxies, he takes one solar system and he puts a bunch of rocks around a little star. And the third rock from that star that we call the sun, he calls the earth. And he puts a little island on it, surrounded by seas. And on that island, he puts a man and a woman. And while they are in the garden, he walks with them a little bit. And then slithering on from stage right is his enemy. And the angels go, God, you got to stop him. Sit down, sit on your cloud. I'm working a plan here. I'm trying to show you something. Watch my story. History is his story. It is not to save everyone, or God would not be just. It is not to condemn everyone, or God would not be loving and merciful. It is a complex story, a nexus of stories to show you who he is. The point is, this is who I am. That's what he's doing. And he's showing it to the angelic world. Do you remember the Ark of the Covenant had a mercy seat, and above it had 2 cherubim, and they were looking down at the place where God would give mercy as they poured blood onto the top of the seat? The angels are watching the story. That's the point. And what happens is, then God actually steps in after the sin of mankind and the rebellion of mankind. Mankind sides with the snake. Mankind sides with the great accuser and enemy and shakes their fist at God. And God says, listen, I got a plan here. I'm bringing you a redeemer. And he says that redeemer is going to come from a woman. And that snake is going to bite the redeemer's heel, but he's going to crush his head. And that's Genesis 3:15. And then God creates the nations and allows the nations to grow. And Satan and his hordes attack the women in order to impregnate them and degrade the race so that there cannot be a Messiah. If you can stop God's plan, that's your only hope. And God waits until there's one family of clean blood and rescues humanity on an ark. And then sends them off that ark. And then begins to grow a series of nations. And out of those nations, he chooses one nation that he would marry. Hosea says he chose out of the nations of the world Israel, not because she was better, not because she was cuter, not because she was more faithful. He chose her because he chose her. And that's the end of God's justification of why. And it says that she was not faithful. And God finally had to say to her, you can't act like that with me. I'm going to put you out of this marriage for a time, but not until she was pregnant and they had a son. I'm stealing now Revelation 12. You know what I'm doing. The woman has a child, and the child is the Messiah, and he is, in fact, born a Jew from a Jewess. And he is told to grow up and to choose a second bride, not the bride of the father, that's Israel, but the bride of the son. And that's not from one nation, but from many people and tribes and kindreds and tongues. That's the church. You and I are not the bride of Christ yet. We are the betrothed of Christ. We will be the bride. The wedding hasn't happened yet. You can't call yourself the bride till the wedding happens, right? So the Father is in heaven, and at one point the Father will look over to the Son and say, now, Son, go and get your bride. And he will come down, and the dead in Christ will rise first, and we which are alive and remain will be caught up together with him in the air, and so shall we ever be with Jesus. Wherever Jesus goes, that's where we're going. And yes, the world is going to get pummeled, but I've got dinner plans during that time. I will be at the bema seat of Christ, followed by the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's in heaven, while what's on earth is pretty bad. We just described it. And then there comes the moment when the estranged bride of the Father, who has sought after and looked for love in all the wrong places, finally that bride in that tribulation period, old Israel, after being beaten, will look up and say, I cannot do this anymore. The Father will turn to the Son and say, go get my bride. And coming in the clouds, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords on his thigh, he will come down, and I will be with him. And if you know him, you are with him. And we come down, and the end of the story is where the Father is reunited to his estranged wife. Zechariah says they will look on him whom they have pierced and cry like a woman who's lost a son. And Romans 11, Paul says, all Israel will be saved in that day when they see him and kneel before him, just as you see and kneel before him. They will be saved the same way you will be, but they'll be saved on one day as a nation, all of them. What about the ones who died the day before? Sorry, it's that day, that hour, that kneeling. Does that make sense? So the end of the story is 2 marriages. And who is watching the story? The angels. And at the end of your eternal existence, you will have written on your forehead in Revelation, I am. We are literally trophies in the trophy case of God. Who's watching? The angelic world at the beginning of the story. They need to say, this is who I am, not who he says I am. And God uses human history, and on your best day, you are an illustration of what God is doing, so that you can tell a story. Now, I had to tell you that story for this story to make sense, because in the text of Scripture, what I know is, got to go through all my pages of what I just stood here and said, what I know is, you get to chapter 12 of Revelation, and there's a woman at the beginning of the story. And it says, I saw a great sign that appeared in heaven, and the woman is the first character who's described. She's clothed with the sun and moon under her feet, had a crown of 12 stars. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all nations. Here's what I want you to see. God's chosen woman shows up. Now, Hosea 2, Isaiah 54 calls Israel God's wife, God's woman. In Hebrew, they're the same thing. And so if it's my woman, it's my wife. And so literally, it's not unusual that I could cite many passages where that is the case. And God's choosing did not mean that she walked faithfully, but he does tell us, Paul does tell us in Romans 11, that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, and that although during the time of the gospel, the Jewish people that reject the gospel are enemies to the gospel at this time, they will yet have the promise of God, and they will all be saved. That's in Romans chapter 11, and that's future to Paul and future to us. Jeremiah 31 says that they'll be brought back to the land, and sometime after they're brought back to the land, they'll get a new heart. They didn't come back into the land with a new heart. They come back in the land with the old heart. So what I have is this woman, and she appears on the scene, and she's well-dressed in a stunning garment. Don't be surprised that she's dressed with the sun, moon, and stars, because Jeremiah 31 says, I love this woman, and the sun, moon, and stars will fall from the heavens, but my love for her will be continuous. So expect that to be in the description of this woman. Don't be surprised that it says she was crowned with 12 stars, because Joseph's dream all the way back in Genesis 37 was he saw that the sons of Israel, were like 12 stars, and they were bowing down. And so you should expect these kinds of things. We know who she is because she's the mother of God's appointed prince. So let's move on to the prince. And in verse 2, you should note that there are some descriptors that help us to know who this prince is. First of all, it's the woman's child. Now, Jesus can be said to be Mary's child or the child of the Jewish people, but those are really your only choices. And we know that he was brought forth in the text in pain. Do you see it in verse 2? Bringing in labor and in pain to give birth. here's the thing I want you to understand. Next Christmas comes up. And when Christmas comes up and we have all of the heavenly hosts around Bethlehem, what are they doing there? In the Hebrew, it's tzvaot. This is the heavenly hosts, the heavenly army. They're guarding the baby. They're not there for a Hallmark choir. They're there to guard the baby. And not only that, they do such a good job that the enemy, who is not omniscient, loses track of who he is and where he is. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up in Nazareth. He ends up at the Jordan River. And when he's baptized and God says, "This is my beloved son," the next thing that happens is Satan pounces on him and there's temptation. The enemy lost track of him. So he is being guarded as a baby in Bethlehem, and that's what they're doing there. And this says that there was a lot of pain and that was associated with his birth. Remember Matthew chapter 2. Remember the babies of Bethlehem slaughtered. Remember Rachel weeping for her children. That's all tied up in the story. We know that he was appointed a ruler by God, and don't forget that 2 Samuel 7 and 1 Chronicles 17 say that the one who is coming, that Jesus will sit on the throne of David, that David will have a ruler on his throne that will deal righteously and in peace, and the nations will flow in and out of Jerusalem before his throne, and he comes to rule all nations. Don't forget that Revelation 11:16 says that on his robe and on his thigh are written, "King above all kings, King above all kings, King of all kings, Lord of all lords." He's caught up to heaven's throne. That's the description. Well, didn't the story in the book of Acts tell you that at the beginning of the book of Acts? "You men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into the sky? This same Jesus which was taken from you is coming back." Let's be very clear about this. Jesus wasn't metaphorically raised from the Mount of Olives. He was physically, bodily raised from the dead, and he was physically, bodily ascended into heaven, and he's coming back the same way, not as a metaphor, but as a guy. Okay, so here's what I know. I know that this book began with the vision of the risen Christ in chapter 1. So what you should see is that the prince is none other than the unmasked Son of God, eternal Son of God, ruler and prince of this world. Now, I drop down to my next player of my 5, and the third one is the dragon. I don't really have to wonder who the dragon is, because in 12:9 it calls him Satan. It says in 12:9, "And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan." Well, you really don't have to do a lot of judgment on this one, but look at the description of him. He is both called a person and the organizer of a rebellious system in verses 3 and 4. This is why verse 3 says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems." There are 2 kinds of crowns in Greek. Stephanos is a victor crown for somebody who participates in games. A diadem is a ruler crown for somebody who sits upon a throne. These are ruler crowns, so it's political power and a political system. And what's interesting is if you go back to Daniel chapter 7, you will find that a head of a national kingdom is marked out as a head, and horns are authorities or sub-rulers of that kingdom. So when you look at this description, what we see is that he's both a person, Satan, and he's the organizer of a rebellious system, and you're going to be shocked. Hold on to your seat. Satan's in politics. Who knew? The political entities could be satanically rising to their position. That it is possible that even in a representative democracy, someone who you never heard of could come out of nowhere, known by virtually no one, and end up in the presidential office. That all of a sudden they had this whole pedigree, but nobody ever heard of them until now they're on the national stage. And you're going to find that increasingly as we come to the last days, that people will be catapulted into great extreme adulation, and nobody will know anything about them, but now they're in charge. And that says that something's behind it. There's a power. It's interesting because in the Bible, we get confused by the timing of things. Isaiah 14 says, "How you have fallen, O heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You've been cast down to the earth. You've been laid low." In Luke 10, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning. And we think in our minds, well, Jesus said he already saw it, so it must have already happened. Again, don't put God in time. The very first command of God is don't shape me because you'll make me less than I am. Don't put me in a box because you don't understand how I work. So be careful about the timing of things when it relates to God. Be careful about how you describe God and how he works. What I want you to see is we're told that there's an innumerable company of angels that was created in Hebrews 12, and 1/3 of them chose to rebel. And we are told that this one prince above them motivates them. But here's the thing. Hasatan occurs 13 times in the Masoretic text, and 10 times of those are in Job 1 and 2. Why is that important? Because the earliest book of the Bible is not Genesis, it's Job. In the first book of the Bible, 10 times, Satan shows up in the first 3 chapters. The story of the earth is that there's been a defection and that something is going on and God is going to bring it to a close. So the Bible tells us about some storylines. It says God, who he is, what he cares about. Satan, who he is and how he tricks. Humanity, what went wrong when we rebelled. And the byline story that he's working toward is salvation, how God can fix what we messed up. And ultimately, what's interesting is chapter 12, verse 7 says that Satan is described as at war with Michael. Look at this. It says, there was a war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and that they were not strong enough, and there was no place found for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who's called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. When? I have no idea. But I know that when he arrives, he ain't happy. So let me say it this way. He's cast out of heaven, he hits the earth, and boy is he ticked. And here's the thing. I know that in Revelation 12:12, he notes that his work is nearing its end. God made a promise. He told his people that his enemy would face defeat with powerful words, that God would crush him under Jesus' feet in Romans 16. That's what God promised. Now, as he gets close to that, Satan has a time limit on his work. So he goes after 2 things, and as it gets later, listen carefully, the 2 things he will aim at will be God's church and God's estranged wife, Israel. And right now, as I travel the world, I'll be in Greece week after next, Italy a week after that, and I'm traveling the world, and as I travel, I run into 2 kinds of people. I run into people who are ready to walk into a square in Tel Aviv and blow themselves up to kill Israelis, and they've never met one. They hate them with a hatred that is unexplainable, but they've never met them. That's satanic. But I also go to churches and I find people that go, I love the Jewish people, but they don't know any. Why? Because along with inordinate hate, there's inordinate love. And that's a work of the Spirit of God right now to give us a tender heart towards something that we have trouble understanding. And my point is simply this. When people ask me, why do you believe God is literal in his promises for the future? In a word, I say Israel. For 2,000 years, a people that were pushed out of their homeland, that traveled without their language, and the language is reborn and the people are restored just like the scripture says, but they don't yet have God's heart. So when I look at this is what I see. I see a couple of other characters that the dragon lines up. He lines up first a beast from the sea. It says, and the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads were blasphemous names. This is the dragon assembling Team Terrible. And the first contestant for Team Terrible, he uses a politician, somebody with political stature in chapter 13, verses 1 to 10, that has a religious structure behind him in 13, 11 to 18. And in short, the dragon is a political machine, is backing a political machine with one I'm going to call Antichrist. He's called the beast from the sea. And what I know is he's some kind of political unit with a confederation of 10 nations with 10 leaders, 7 of them that are elevated above the others. I can't describe to you much more than that, but I can tell you that if you were here during the tribulation period, you would see it and you would understand the group of 7 or the 10 nations, and they'd have a really cool logo and a really great media riff that would be given to you. And what I can tell you is it was a very specific political unit that was pagan. And adding to that, I see yet another beast. Now, before I get to that other beast, I just want you to see there's some ways in which you can look at this and you can see, how did somebody become that important? Wouldn't you like to know, how does somebody become that important? You know, in fact, I'm going to go back to that. I want you to see something. There is health care at the center of the rise of the Antichrist. Go to Revelation 13:3 for a minute, and it says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast, and they followed the dragon, which he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to wage war with him? There's a confederation of nations that's gathered around. The dragon backs this beast from the sea, this antichrist person who has something happen to him. What happens that the nations are willing to follow him? Well, it's really simple. Before you start reading this as hocus pocus in some kind of bizarre way, think of it this way. What if a rising star came from a medical background? What if he unlocked the human genome in a lab in a way that was never seen before? What if his company controlled the proprietary information that could heal a worldwide pandemic? They could both release it and solve it. You can't believe such a thing could happen. What if he controlled both the release of the pandemic and the cure? Can you hear the end of verse 4? People in Washington and Brussels and Beijing and Tokyo going, who is like the beast? Who can fight that? We can't fight that. Just this week, Politico ran something, I don't know if you saw it, that 4 people walked in and took over the governments of the world in COVID. Politico is a left-leaning rag. And it said that 4 organizations took over all of our governments and told them what to do all the way through COVID. We're talking about 180 nations that couldn't even get together on the menu at the UN. And within a week, everybody was saying the same thing, doing the same thing, wearing the same mask. You have never seen the world align like it aligns right now. And if you're waiting for some later time 100 years from now, you don't really have to wait that long. We can see the marks of things happening. I don't know if that's related. I can only tell you, wait a minute, let's go a different way. What if this ruler isn't sick? What if his power is absolutely destroyed because he's politically disgraced? And he comes back from the dead after he's politically disgraced. And people say, there's just no, how do you beat a guy like this? He just comes back when he's politically disgraced and nobody can stop him. You see what I'm saying? We think of these as bizarre prophecies, but we're watching them happen right in front of our eyes. There was a mayor of one of our major cities in America who was caught with cocaine in his nose and then reelected. Don't tell me this stuff doesn't happen. So what I know is he's devoid of character and blasphemous and powerful. See, when I look back and I look at what it says, I see in chapter 13, the second half has a beast from the land. I skipped this slide, so just hang on with the slides for a minute. We'll catch up. But in 13:11 through 18, the dragon pulled out of the earth a beast beside the Antichrist. I'm going to call him the false prophet. That's in 13:11. It says, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. What does that mean? It means he's all cute and cuddly on the surface, but wait till he opens his mouth. You know what he is? He uses signs to get people to honor and revere the political leadership of the Antichrist. You know what he is? He's a media company. He's a PR firm. He's what we call the false prophet in the Bible, but what he actually is are people in a sign-crazed generation are drawn to him as he uses incredible signs in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 13, where he brings them in and he appears to be a powerful messaging guru. Listen to 13:15. It says, it was given to him to breathe to the image of the beast, to give breath to it, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. That whatever this is, it's some kind of media giant able to get people to move when it says move. You can't believe that there would be something like that. You can't believe that in our civilized, technologically advanced society, that people would be so crazy as to do things they're told in mass numbers when they make no sense. You couldn't believe that, could you? And here's the thing, he's going to demand the mark of obedience. He causes small and great, rich and poor, free and slave to get a mark on their hand and their forehead. See, he's all about branding, literally, and positioning the brand. He's a media company with a citizen identification mark that operates a financial system. And the mark says, I belong to this system. Pairing religious deception with political power will produce zealous followers. And here's what I want you to see. So chapter 12 introduced us, back to the slide, Satan and the dragon. Chapter 13 builds Team Terrible. There is a beast from the sea, Antichrist, and a beast from the land. We'll call him the false prophet. I call him the media guru. And if you keep going with the story, we're going to look at it, but it comes a little bit later in our story because it deals now specifically with the witnesses that God has going on during the tribulation period. When you get to chapter 16, we already covered the bowl judgments. So if you're following the progression, here's what I want you to see. Chapter 17 is where I want to land my feet in a little bit of the collusion of what happens in the system of the ecclesiastical Babylon. Listen, God wants to take down false religion. That's what he wants to do. Why? Why? Because every religion that dangles something pretty in front of people and pulls them away from a real walk with God defeats the very reason God made you. He made you for a walk with him. And it's either direction toward him or distraction away. In Revelation 18, God wants to unmask the demonic backing that's part of the financial and commercial system that is bound to lead you away. Let me just cut through all that and say what I'm saying. God stands opposed to a religious system that's backing an economic system that's sucking people's hearts away from a walk with Jesus. That's what he's doing. And he's about to take aim. And so I want to look at chapter 17 to see if I can see exactly what's happening. There are three parts to the story of chapter 17. And in chapter 17, a promise was made by an angel to John in 17, 1 and 2, that if he watches closely, he'll understand what's going on. Some of you at this point are going, boys, please tell me what's going on. Okay. Chapter 1, vision of the risen Christ. 2 and 3, letters to 7 churches. 4 and 5, heaven. 6, into the beginning of 7, sealed judgments. 8, trumpet judgments. Now I'm jumping 16, and that'll give you the last of the judgments, the bowl or vial judgments. But in that period of 6 to 18, we're missing two other features. One of them is God's decimation of the religious harlot and God's taking down of Team Terrible, including the Antichrist and the false prophet. And the second thing we're missing is God's witnesses, I want to talk about in the next hour. Watch what he does as he takes this apart. I want you to see something. There's a promise. John got lost halfway through Revelation. How many of you have done that? Okay? John got lost and he was like, what's going on? And the angel said, hang in there with me, John. Hang in there. I promise this is going to make sense. And then in verses 3 to 6, he says, there's a vision and I want you to see it. Now, in the Bible, a harlot represents a false relationship. So here's what I want you to see. I want you to see that there's a woman that it represents a city here who's a harlot that has a false relationship. And in fact, he goes on and says, if you'll hang in there with me, I'll even give you an explanation. And he turns and he looks at John and says, why are you wondering? I will tell you, verse 7, the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. Look, here's the promise. If I'm going to walk with God and I'll listen to his word, he'll tell me what I need to know. The Bible doesn't tell you everything. There's no algebra in the Bible. That doesn't mean algebra is wrong. I used to think so when I was a student, but it doesn't mean that. What it means is it's not essential for me to have a walk with God. This is everything that's necessary for my walk with God. So he says, the angel says to him, listen, if you'll listen to me, I'll tell you what this is about. The beast in 17:8 and 11 came from a pit, as did his empowering spirit. That's the devil. And the Antichrist poked his head into human history several times. Now, sometimes people will ask me, is the Antichrist born yet? My own personal understanding is that there's always the potential person in each generation. The reason I say that is in Daniel 11, Antiochus IV Epiphanes was called an Antichrist. And then the second half of the chapter says he left and then he comes back. There's a spirit of something that exists that is already at work. John says there's a spirit of Antichrist already at work out there. I can't even describe for you what I'm seeing on college campuses. There's a rising tide of people that think when I was growing up, the Bible was a good book. It's now considered on college campuses an evil book. What kind of God do you serve? Somebody that would kill his own son? What kind of story is that? And you routinely read on the college campus that the Bible is filled with inequities and filled with horrible things. And what we're doing, listen, when wrong becomes right in America, right becomes wrong. And what you're watching is when wrong becomes right, right becomes wrong, and then right becomes illegal. And in short order, you're not allowed to think that way because it's just wrong. I see that he was before, in Daniel 11:36, he was before and is again. So there's a system with 7 heads in 17, 9, and 10. And God cut down both the Antichrist and his messenger in chapter 18. Here's what I want you to see. Chapter 18 is all about the false system that is called the harlot. I want you to remember something. God feels about religion what a bride feels about a temptress to her would-be husband. God feels about religion what a bride feels about a temptress, adulterous person who's trying to woo away their man. Whatever offers satisfaction without real relationship is a dead end and will bring nothing but suffering and hardship. So God is going to unmercifully crush false religion, and he's going to look at it because the best of humanity has been deceived with trickery, and God's going to step in and say, enough, you have to come to me. There is no life and hope in this relationship. So Revelation 18 opens announcing the doom of a false religious system. And you know what heaven does? I'm moved by this. You know what heaven does at the beginning of chapter 18? God says, I interrupt the regularly scheduled broadcast of the world to bring you a special bulletin. I am done with this false religion. And you know what heaven does? Woo! Great job, God. You know why? Because heaven's filled with parents whose kids have been captured and hearts have been taken away by a system that was designed to destroy them. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. We die 1,000 deaths over our kids, don't we? And the truth is, in heaven, there's a plenty of applause. It's interesting, 18:7 says this. I don't know if you caught this. The harlot of false religion and morality seems surprised when she's unmasked and decimated. It says, to the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen and I am not a widow and will never see mourning. Listen, religion offered what seemed like a relationship, but it wasn't, and it thought it was protected or hidden or secretive. She is going to be exposed. False religions across the globe are going to be exposed. False faith will be unmasked. Man-made religion is going to get defrocked by Jesus. And what it says is in 18:9 and 10, the secret diary of the prostitute of false religion is going to be made public. And it's interesting in 18:11 to 19, the false economy that props up all these false religious notions is going to be ripped apart. And a great stone is going to crush it. I want you to see something. What does heaven do in 1820? Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment against her. You know what happens? God says, wait a minute, I intended a marriage. I intended unending intimacy with mankind, and you have interjected one false adulterous relationship after another into this marriage to steal away the hearts of people, and I'm going to end this. In heaven, there are those who have suffered at the hands of persecutors, those who have fought against inquisitions of angry men who serve the enemy's needs. They are going to praise God that God says, enough of false religion. There are missionaries and apostles and Christians who have suffered bitter cruelties dealt by people in smug faces and religious garb that yelled at them when they told the truth. Their day ends here. The rejoicing is not just an expression of revenge, it's pent-up pain. After thousands of years of the gospel being tamped down and destroyed by people who were trying to martyr one missionary after another, there is a time when God says, enough, and He will stop it. Every parent that lost a child to some sect knows this pain. Every child that's lost a father or mother on the field of service where they were butchered for their faith understands exactly what this is. Beloved, all believers will be able to rejoice the day the false doors and the false wooing of fallen and vicious men have stopped. Listen carefully. There is coming a day when in every great false faith of the world, their violence will destroy. Her music will stop playing. Their organs will fall silent. The violins will play no more. The flute will be hushed. The mills will stop, the workers will cease, the shops will close, the hope of the future is cut off. There's no more wedding songs sung in her cathedrals, and it seems like God is saying it over and over and over. Why? Because they wouldn't heed that His voice is the only true voice, and marriage to Him is the only reality. Beloved, the problem is, everybody's out there trying to make up their own idea about how things should work. I want to tell you a story, and it's my hope that this story will kind of bring this together for you. Wally Butler posted this 3 months ago. It's the first time I heard the story. Recently, a lawyer shared this story. It might help us. He said, I was in Alaska working on a lawsuit out of the Aleutian Islands. I was getting ready to return to Anchorage. I had a ticket in my pocket to get on the plane when a pastor I had met came up to me and said, listen, I can save you some money. I was intrigued. I said, how's that? Pastor said, well, I flew a small plane up here and I got to take it back. So you can keep that ticket in your pocket and turn it in. I can take you back. Well, that didn't sound all that great to me. So I said, well, thank you very, very much. But I got this ticket. My friend and I are just making our way back home. Well, as you can imagine, he insisted, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We drove out to the airport, got our ticket, checked in, and loaded up. He got in on the left front, and I was in on the right front, and the other lawyer that was with me sat behind me. And we started up and taxied out and prayed. And got on the runway as we started down the runway. I tried to put off the flight as long as I could, so I prayed, and I prayed a long time. But eventually we went down and it lifted off gently, and we started climbing, and it all seemed like it was going flawlessly. And it was. A few minutes in, we started to reach a cloud bank, and the pilot turned to me and said something I'm never going to forget. He said, now we're going into clouds, and I can't fly in clouds. They make me pass out. They make you what? He says, they make me pass out. Now, it'd been cloudy all day, sure enough, and when we got into the clouds, I kid you not, he looked at me and his eyes rolled back in his head and he started mumbling and he passed out cold. I grabbed him and I shook him and said, come on, you got to wake up so I can kill you. So there we were in the clouds, flying along with no pilot. My friend in the back seat said, we're dead, aren't we? I said, well, there's a very good chance of that, yes. He said, well, what should we do? I said, I don't know, but there's a radio here. See if you can get somebody to help us. I handed him the microphone and told him to start asking for help. Now, he's picked it up, and the spiral cord went all the way to the back, and he said, hello? Hello? We didn't know any proper radio etiquette, but somebody answered, and the voice said, "Don't you guys know proper radio etiquette?" I grabbed the mic and I said, "No, we don't. We're in an airplane with a passed-out pilot, and we don't know how to fly this thing." The voice from the other pilot in a freighter coming out of Anchorage on the way to Tokyo said, "You're telling me you don't have anybody who can fly that plane?" "That's correct," we responded. By then I was sweating bullets. He said, "The first thing I'm going to do is start circling so I don't lose you, because I'll fly out of range of your radio and then you won't have me anymore." He said, "I'm going to get Anchorage Emergency for you, and they're the people that can help save your life." After about 5 minutes, Anchorage came on and said, "We understand you have a passed-out pilot and no one on the plane that can fly it. Is that right?" We heartily agreed. Then he said something critical. Listen to what he said. "Well, the first thing is we got a job to find you. Now, it's my job to get you home safe. That's my job." But he said, "Here's the deal. If you want to come home safe, you got to promise me you'll obey my voice." He said, "Listen to me now. You can't see me, but I can see you." Then he said, "If you're not going to obey my voice, you're going to die. I mean that. When you can't see anything and you have no idea how disoriented you become, I need you to follow my voice. I need you to do what I tell you to do. Don't look at the instruments. Don't look at the area. Do what I tell you to do." He said, "Okay, I found you." I was listening to every word. "Now, hear me clearly. You are 4 minutes from a mountain." He said, "You're going to crash into a mountain if you don't follow my instructions." He had my full attention. Now, I have to say at this point, I never thought to say to him, "Listen, I'm not really sure it's reasonable for you to ask me to do stuff." It never occurred to me to say, "Hey, what are your qualifications to ask me to do this?" You know why? Because I understood without his voice, I didn't have any hope of living, and I wanted to live. Well, in a few steps, he got our plane turned. We banked hard, and he said, "I'm freezing all traffic in the area, and it's going to take me an hour and a half to get you to Anchorage. There's a lot of weather between you and Anchorage. You are in for a rough ride, but I want you to hear me. I want you to hear me. I don't want you to look at what's going on outside. I don't want you to pay attention to the storm. I want you to focus on my voice. No matter what happens, if you start watching the storms, you're going to make wrong moves and you will surely die. Listen to what I'm saying." The traffic cleared. Several pilots in distant night freighters on 747s talked with us and said, "We're praying for you guys. You're going to make it. Just remember, listen to the voice of Anchorage Ground. That's the key." They told us, "Trust that voice." Looking back, I can see it, Your head gets full of voices and everybody in the world wants to talk to you and be the controlling voice in your head. How many times did God say to me, "Listen to me, I want you to be a living sacrifice. I want you to put yourself on the altar. I want you to let my voice be your final voice." I never realized what it was he was saying until I was flying in that plane. I didn't see it. Well, here's the thing. We went through the worst of the weather, and then he came back on from Anchorage Ground, and he said, "Now, I'm going to line you up." "Line me up for what?" He said, "No, I'm going to bring you into the runway. You're almost here." He said, "Now listen, don't get distracted. I want you to do exactly what I tell you." He said, I need you to follow my voice, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you when I tell you to do it." He said, and I said to him, "Absolutely, I am with you." He said, "Now listen, I'm going to line you up, and I want you to keep your eyes on the end of the runway. There are lights in the form of a cross. You must follow the cross. Do not take your eyes off the direction ordinate signal of the cross." He started to bring us down. And after a while, I landed the plane. In fact, I did it 7 times, bouncing each time. I kept landing it and landing it and landing it. But eventually, I was able to shut the engine off. It came to a stop, and I couldn't believe it. My buddy behind me grabbed me, but you are not going to believe what happened next. We hit the ground, and we were not on the ground for 1 minute, and did not the pilot open his eyes and say, "What happened?" I couldn't believe it. I got out of the plane. I got to my motel room that night, and I was still shaking. I tried to sleep, It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I was still wide awake, still shaking. There was a knock on my door. I opened the door, and there was a man standing in front of me who just said, "Hello, David." And I said, "You're the voice. You're the one who brought me home." I read that to you because I want you to understand something. We are living in a time when we are going to get shaken and storms are going to be there. That I know. But there's a voice that will get you home, and there's the ordinal direction of the cross. If you don't listen to the voice and obey and follow what it is he said, you are not going to make this journey well. But if you will listen carefully and follow him, you will navigate the storms even through a horrible period. You know what people say to me? Well, how do you know you're not going to go through the tribulation? Well, I don't think I am, but can I tell you that if I lived right now where Boko Haram is, I don't know that I would know the difference. That doesn't mean that every believer is going to have a great ride. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be trouble coming for believers in this time. And can I just say this? This is just a 5-cent freebie. But if you were to ask me what a falling away of the church looked like, I'd call it what happened in COVID. I just talked to a president of one of our colleges, and he said to me, we had the best enrollment this year that we've ever had. I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "Well, that was easy. There used to be 3,000 colleges. Now there's 2,500 Christian colleges left. The other 500 aren't coming back." Do you understand what we've just lost? A third of the people that were walking in and out of evangelical churches haven't come back. We've taken a blow. And we're acting like we can just carry on and not understand. I think we're seeing a massive falling away from the truth. So what does that mean? It means we step up our game and say what we're saying louder and clearer. It means we walk it out with the confidence. Guys, when I was in Israel, we used to get Monday Night Football on videotape every Thursday. Can I tell you, when you already know that your team won from Monday night and you're watching it Thursday, here's what I want you to know. I don't care if my team is down a whole touchdown in the last minute. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter because it's Thursday and I saw this back on Monday. Guess what? My team's going to win, so I'm not worried about it. Listen, we've got to stop arguing as if we're coming defensively from a loss. Jesus wins this. We are coming from victory's side. So I want you to understand the false religions of this world are going to be laid bare. The false economies are going to be stripped down. The false politicians, that's kind of an oxymoron. The false politicians are going to be laid bare. All of this is going away. And what will rise out of it is the one with King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he will reign in righteousness. And he will reign in truth. And he will reign purely to have a relationship with you. And he wants a relationship with you. Please understand this story is not bad. It's good. But you got to go through pain like surgery because you need it and it's going to make you better.